But anyhow, so we are in Esther. We're looking at the end of chapter 4, getting into chapter 5. Up to this point, we have, that Vashti, she has been, nixed from the royal family. She's no longer queen because of disobeying Ahasuerus or Xerxes, depending on your translation. That they have sought out a new queen. Takes about a year of preparation. You've got, again, it's kind of a finishing school, if you will. This is, how to use perfumes and cosmetics, and this is how to walk, and all of that type of stuff. And Esther, a Jew, is keeping her identity secret. And you have Haman, a prince, who he is promoted, and he is just under the king. And everybody is ordered by the king to kind of bow and to honor him, but you have this one guy, this one stubborn guy, Mordecai, who refuses to do so. And so, Haman, getting upset and finding some things out, he goes to the king, and he selectively leaves things out when he's reporting to King Xerxes. And he just explains, look, there's a people in all of your provinces who they don't worship you, they don't honor you, they don't worship your God, they follow their own rules, they care less about you. And so I'd like to annihilate them. And so he casts lots to determine. The king gives his signet ring to be able to seal this, and then he casts lots to determine a day, and it's about a year out when they're going to do that. And so also in this time is that Mordecai has really saved the king in telling of some treachery, and that was written down. And so Esther, she's learned of Haman's plot here in chapter 4. And, excuse me. It's always kind of strange when you cough on it, when you choke on a cough drop. I don't think that's how they work. And so Esther, she's speaking to a chief eunuch and telling him to rely on Mordecai. And verse 11 of chapter 4 is particularly important. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And this is Esther speaking, and I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. So there is but one law as far as approaching the king. Unless the king calls you, you do not approach him, otherwise you are to be put to death. So imagine Esther's predicament at this point. She has learned of Haman's plot to annihilate men, women, children, her people, the Jewish people. And so she's also queen and wants to help her people. But there's this situation where, on the one hand, I need to do what's right and I need to help my people, but on the other hand, just by me coming into the presence of the king, I can be put to death. Right? So Mordecai, he finally convinces Esther that maybe divine providence has put her in this place. In verse 14 of chapter 4, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Now, some translations say, who knows, maybe you were born for such a time as this, right? And Mordecai, he's telling her, he's like, God's not going to let his people perish. He's not going to let them be wiped off the face of the planet. You have to remember, when we go back to the Abrahamic covenant and consider as we're going through looking at this portrait of God, Everything is looking back to the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3, the curse there in Genesis 3, the covenant made in Genesis chapter 12. So when we look in Genesis chapter 12 and God telling him to leave, he says in verse 2, I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all the families of the earth will be blessed. And remember, he tells him that, as countless as the stars in the sky, that's going to be, his descendants, his people. God's not going to let that happen. That's what Mordecai is telling Esther. He's not going to allow this covenant that he made with Abraham to default just because you didn't do something. God will find a way to preserve his people. But because you did not stand up for God's people, you, your father's household, and everything that you have, queen or not, that's all going to vanish. It's all going to perish. Right? Anybody recall Rahab and what she did? Yeah, helping the spies. Here we have a less than savory woman, or a woman of less than savory reputation, not of the Jewish people, but these spies come into the land, and she says, our people have heard of your God and what he has done for you. So even though she was not of those people, chooses to help those people. And because of that, everybody else perishes, and yet she and those in her household are spared. Right? Kind of the same thing in the sense that if Ezra's it's been a day already. If Esther's not going to help God's people, God will find someone who will. And then Esther, she'll just be left out in the cold. And then, so, having prepared a banquet for the king and Haman, Xerxes inquires of Esther regarding the request. So, chapter 5, verse 1, it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's room. So, she's not in his presence, she's just in that court. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. A simple way to look at that. We're sitting here in class on Sunday mornings, and at some point when we get near the end of the class, we're going to see people standing out there. And they're going to get someone's attention, and then someone is going to kind of wave them in. That's what's going on, is that the king, he is in his throne in this inner room, and Esther, she is standing outside in the outer court, and she catches his attention, and so he calls her in. And then, verse 3, the king of chapter 5, the king says to her, what's troubling you, Queen Esther, and what's your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be given you. Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And the king said, bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. They drank wine at the banquet. The king said to Esther, what's your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom. So Esther replied, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says. So you would think at this point, a typical reaction might be, I am the queen. The king sees that I'm troubled. He wants to know. He will give me whatever I want, up to half the kingdom. In fact, he tells her that twice in these few verses. But she doesn't just jump out and say, okay, look, Haman's trying to kill my people because I'm a Jew and I want to take them out. Which she could have done. Now, what the king's reaction to that might have been, who knows? He would have certainly done that. because a king is bound by his word, and said that it would give it. But she doesn't. She kind of, remember, this is, almost a year out, right, before this happens. So she's got a little bit of time, and she's playing it smart, and kind of laying the trap. Verse 9, Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, he was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons in every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman also said, even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So Haman, he doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. He's just got this kind of big head about himself. And just pause for a second and think of what Haman has. He has all of these possessions. He's very wealthy. He has a large family. He has a wife who presumably loves him and looks out for him in her own way. He has power and position because he is just below the king. He's over every prince. He can speak in the name of the king and it be heard. He is honored by all of these people. Esther has, now unbeknownst to him, he doesn't know what she's planning, but even the queen has invited him to this banquet, and it's just going to be the three of them and the servants. A private dinner, Now, it only takes one thing for him not to be satisfied. And that's someone who's not boosting his ego by honoring him. Honoring God instead. I'll tell you, you can have all the power and position that the earth can offer. But that really offers nothing of any value. Not in God's eyes. God was more honored by one Jew sitting at the gates, not bowing down to this man, than he was at any point by Haman. And think of this. You are, and this happens in politics the world over, you are a world-renowned CEO of, Fortune 100 company. You got plenty of wealth. People listen to you. You can buy whatever you want. You can buy whoever you want. Have people do whatever you want. President calls you up and says, hey, you want to come have dinner at my house? Just me, you and the wife, just kind of hang out. Get that big boost. That's the type of real kind of authority that we're talking here. And yet he's not satisfied because not everything is falling toward him. That there is still one in this place here that is holding out for God. Can't be satisfied with the world. That's why when it comes to looking at the agendas of the world, and people start talking about, well, we'll be satisfied if we just get these rights. We'll be satisfied if we just get this access. We'll be satisfied if we just get this, if we just get that. No, you won't. Because the world does not satisfy no matter how much you have. Right? That's why Jesus said, don't lay up for yourselves treasures here on earth where thieves break in and steal and rusts and moths eat, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where those things, those earthly elements can't access. And so he's upset with this. And, verse 13 of chapter 5, yet all of this does not satisfy every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. He's just not thinking, you know, and quite frankly, neither is his wife. But in a sense, who can blame him? I mean, let's just be fair. Haman's not a Jew. He's got no honor to God. He could care less about God. He could care less about the Jewish people. He's upset. His wife gives him some advice, and he takes her advice. Who doesn't do that, or who hasn't done that? You know? I mean, he's acting in a very human way, and in a way that many of us have acted in times of being angry, and so we do something rash, and we're not thinking about it, or we're angry about a situation. We tell a friend, and a friend gives us advice, and we just take the advice and run with it. I'm sure that's happened to all of us at least once at some point in our life, even if it may have been many years ago. So he's acting in a very human way. And then God intervenes at the beginning of verse 6. He intervenes. During the night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended said, "Nothing's been done for him." So see, at this point, Xerxes, Ahasuerus, he had no idea what had transpired regarding Mordecai. And so you can't say that it's just by happenstance. These are the Chronicles of the Kings. So they're not some little thin Cliff Notes version of history, right? There are several volumes of the Chronicles because it's recounting all the kings. And yet, it just so happens that the night before Haman is going to ask the king to have him killed, the king can't sleep. He asked that the Chronicles of the Kings of all things be read to him. He doesn't ask for Esther to come lie in his bedchamber. He doesn't ask for any of the other versions that have been collected of the 127 provinces to come lie in his bedchamber with him. He doesn't go out and say, "I'm just going to kill some people for sport." He's not like, Peter, "I'm going fishing." He's not doing any of that. He sits there and picks up probably one of the most boring books on the planet, and a particular volume of that, and says, "Read it to me." I mean, quite honestly, just to give a picture, that would be like me turning at 3 o'clock in the morning and saying, "You know what, Rachel? I just can't get to sleep. Would you mind reading the book of Leviticus to me?" Ain't no one going to do that. And so God, he really does intervene because it just so happens that that's the book that he's reading, that's the particular volume, and that's the particular section. We can't say that it's all by happenstance or that it's all by accident. And the king's like, "I didn't even know that this happened. So what's been done for this man?" And there's nothing. Nothing's been done for him. So the king said, in verse 4, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak with the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. Talk about a twist of fate right there. So now you've got Haman who's in the outer court. You're like, "Oh man, I'm about to get this guy." The king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king, it could have been anyone. See, this is how God works. Sometimes we've got to pause and we've got to look back. We are in the king's court. He can't sleep. Right? Who else could have been in the court? Could have been servants. Could have been guards. Could have been, peasants getting shops and everything set up. It could have been anyone, but no. It's Haman. The very person who wants to have Mordecai killed. So the king says, "Well, show him in," verse 5. So Haman came in, the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, so he's thinking to himself, wouldn't the king desire to honor more than me? After all, I'm wealthy. He's put me above all the princes in these 127 provinces. Got a big family. He's already told people to bow down to me. He gave me his signet ring, and he's letting me about to kill a whole ton of people. You know? Who could the king possibly want to honor more than what? Right? More than me. So Haman, of course, thinking it's about himself, came in and he goes in there. For the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king is ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man with the king whom the king desires to honor, and let him lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. It's kind of interesting. When I read this particular section of Esther, you know what I think of? I think of the hymn when we're sitting there singing, I want a mansion, a robe, and a crown. You know, I also think of that we'll receive a crown. You know, but when we look at this system of honor, you know, Christ being our king, we think types and shadows. Christ being our king, and we want to honor Christ, and in return, we do selfishly want to be honored ourselves. Why? We're pursuing a crown. Paul said he was pursuing a crown. There was a crown laid up for me. You know? And we want to receive that honor. So then the king says to Haman, that's a good idea. You know? Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. See, that's kind of interesting because because now Xerxes knows that Mordecai still doesn't know about Esther, but he knows Mordecai is a Jew. And the only reason he knew that is because it was recorded in the Chronicles of the Kings. Because remember, he knew nothing about Mordecai in the entire event before that. So now you have, and this really is like kind of one of those Tom Clancy spy novel espionage type things that's going on. You've got one guy over here who's trying to wipe out an entire people. You've got a king who's honoring a guy who belongs to those people and who has given the order for them to be killed and has no idea of what's transpiring. It really is. Esther truly is a wonderful book. And so you do that. He's sitting at the king's gate. Don't fall short in anything of all that you had said. So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. I can't even picture what Haman's face must have looked like at that point. You know. Talk about keeping up appearances, right? Haman, so then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning, with his head covered. I'm going to take my ball, I'm going to go home, I'm going to complain to my wife, who's already tired of me complaining. He recounts to Zeresh's wife and all his friends. Why is it that when something is shameful, sometimes we just have to spread it around, even if it's about ourselves? He could have just kept it between him and his wife, you know? But no, he tells everybody, everything that happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Now why? Right, he wants all the Jews killed, but think about it. She says, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him. Yeah, God's in charge, and for me, I truly do think to Rahab, even though Zeresh, Haman, they're not Jews, they have heard of what God does for the Jewish people. And so she's saying, if he is of Jewish origin, there is no way that you are going to overcome him. We've heard about God bringing them out of slavery. We've heard about them crossing the Jordan. We've heard about them being in the wilderness. We have heard all of these things. So if Mordecai is a Jew, you're in trouble. You're not going to overcome him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Nothing more planned. You know, he's already built the gallows and he's got that planned, so now they're just sitting out there collecting dust. You know, like in one of those old western towns in Texas, one of those ghost towns, you know. They're just out there collecting dust now because he can't do anything, and even his wife says, you're not going to be able to defeat him, not if he's a Jew. It's just not going to happen. Hate to disappoint you, honey. And then the eunuchs come in and they brush him off. And then the plea. Well, before we get into the plea, any thoughts or comments? I haven't opened it up for thoughts or comments since I started.
Well, my question was, because he's a Jew, then you're not going to overcome him. When she told him to hang him, she knew he was a Jew, didn't she? Because he knew he was a Jew sitting in front of the gate.
Well, when we look at it, is that we don't necessarily know. We know that Haman knows, but not necessarily that she does it unless...
She may not know.
Yeah. But then also, where is it here?
Well, she said if he is.
Yeah, if he's actually that. You know, if he is actually a Jew. You know. Let's see here. Let me go back.
Verse 13, I think. Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, in verse 3, in verse 13 of chapter 5, he does say that she's a Jew, or that he's a Jew. So he does tell the wife, but there's not really a confirmation for them, you know. The only confirmation comes when the king reads the Chronicles of the Kings, and he said, you know, Mordecai the Jew, and it's recorded and all that stuff. And then she said, okay, if he really is a Jew, you know. So, yeah, so she knew, but not really any confirmation. But then, now that the king has read this account and told Haman to do all this, now it's really confirmed. Yeah.
And she really wasn't seeing when she and her friend said, make this gallows.
Yeah, there was no confirmation that he was actually a Jew at that point. It was just kind of speculation, you know. Talk. Were you going to say something?
Maybe because he didn't bow down to him? Do you think that might have been the reason?
Yeah, I mean, he could, where is it here? And that'll give you a chance. Trying to look here. The actual verse. Okay, so if you look in chapter 3, in verse 4, for example, you know, his fellow guards have been trying to convince him and, you know, to bow down and all of this, and finally he relents and he says that he's a Jew. And then Haman, verse 5, sees that he doesn't bow down, doesn't pay homage. He's filled with rage and whatnot. And then, verse 6, he disdainfully hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, he sought to destroy all Jews. So it's really kind of like the telephone game. So Mordecai is a Jew. He's keeping it secret, but he's not bowing down to Haman. The guards are kind of pushing him. Why? And eventually he relents and says that he's a Jew. He doesn't tell Haman he's a Jew. He tells these two fellow guards that are really just kind of annoying him that he's a Jew. And it's those guards that tell Haman that he's a Jew. And then Haman tells his wife that he's a Jew. Nothing actually confirmed, though. It's a whole bunch of rumors. Haman could have easily gone to Mordecai, considering his position that he was. Are you a Jew? Are you Jewish? Do you worship Yahweh? Is that why you're... And he could have gotten it right there, but instead he's paying attention to everybody else. The guard said he was... It's rumor. Now, granted, it does turn out to be true, but it's still rumor or gossip at this point, right? And so, when he talks to his wife the first time, it's just kind of, these guys say he's a Jew, and they've got no reason to lie to me. Okay, well, build some gallows and we'll take him out. Yeah.
They still don't know Esther's a Jew.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So when this didn't happen the way the wife thought it should be, then she realized the Jewish people had a God that would save them. So she said, don't do anymore.
Well, no, she doesn't necessarily say don't do anymore. She's like, you're not going to overcome them. And it's all happening relatively quickly because we're within just a span of a couple of days. Because when we go back, we find in chapter 4 and verse 16, Esther, she's replying to Mordecai, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susha and fast for me, do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. So it's just a matter of days, really. That Haman he's been dishonored by Mordecai, goes, tells his wife, suspects he's a Jew because of what these people over here said. Okay, go build some gallows. Then the king can't sleep. He figures out what Mordecai did, calls Haman in. Haman puffs all this stuff up, and hey, I think you should do all of this stuff. And he's like, all right, well, you go ahead and do that for, Mordecai the Jew out there. And so after he does that, then he goes home, he's shamed, he's got his head covered, and he's, And so he gets home and finally, well, if he is of Jewish origin, you're not going to win. And while he's still talking to her, see, she doesn't even get an opportunity to say, no, don't do this. Because while they're still talking, the king's eunuchs come in and they rush him off. Yeah, to this banquet that Esther is planning. And so there's, we also somewhat think, when I was talking before about how Esther didn't just jump right into it when the king said, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. Well, had she just immediately said, okay, this is what Haman's done, we'll see why a king couldn't do a certain thing next week. But if she had just immediately kind of jumped into that, Mordecai would never have been honored. And, because or may not, God knows better than I do. But things are playing out kind of exactly as how God wants for that. Any other closing thoughts or questions?
Well, when you mentioned the song that came to your mind,
Oh,
the one,
right. Yeah.
the one that comes to my mind is less of self and all of thee.
Yeah.
Because Haman definitely wasn't thinking of anybody but himself.
Yeah. If John the Baptist, he must increase, I must decrease. Any other thoughts? And I'm going to wake him in from the outer court. Yeah. All right. right, so next week we'll pick up with chapter 7. We'll go ahead and pick up chapter 7 here. Thank y'all very much.